Hi students, welcome back. So this week we are going to be focusing on a study of global economic flows. Now, in the previous chapter, what we were doing was we were looking at some structures which actually facilitated or shaped the movement of these economic flows. In contrast to that, in this chapter, we are really going to be taking a closer look at the economic flows themselves. So just logistics, to get logistics out of the way, we are going to be looking at the chapter on global economic flows from Rutzer and Dean's textbook. So what do we mean by a focus on economic flows? In this chapter, we are going to be looking closely at some different types of economic flows. Okay, but apart from that, we are also going to be looking at two other things. We are going to be looking at some of the pathways or routes that these commodities or values, etc. We'll talk about activities. Some of the pathways that they are taking in this movement of various things which have an economic value. Apart from that, we are also going to be looking at certain processes which have generated or shaped economic flows. Now, these processes are not really the same thing as structures, and by processes we mean certain kinds of events or systematic events which have shaped the movement of these flows. Okay, uh, I want you to also keep in mind, and this is something I reminded you about in the last chapter as well, that typically when we talk about economic flows, we are not only talking about the movement of money and finances or the movement of products or services, we are also looking at the people and the idea flows involved. Okay, usually that's something that gets less attention, but as students of sociology, it's important for us to consider this as well. So we can start our discussion by looking at two. No, actually, let's take a look at this image first. So there's this very interesting image that Ritzel and Dean have provided on page 175 of the text, and it actually shows you a map of the world. And you will see that different countries have been given different colors in this map. They're all different shades of blue and gray. So the quote for the map is that the darker the shade of the country, it means that the higher their per capita income. Per capita income means the income of the average person in that particular country. Okay, um, and the other thing that you will see here is that they have used arrows to show the flow of commodities from one country to another. And even here, you will see that the thickness of the arrows differs. So the thicker the arrow, that means the higher the volume of trade. The thinner the arrow, it means that the lower the volume of trade. So I thought, pictorially, it's a very interesting way of seeing in some ways world trade at this point. Okay, and this is a contemporary picture that they have given. I wanted to read out a bit some excerpts from the text here. So Ritzer and Dean note that, of course, that the arrows show the value of trade between major regions of the world. More than half of world trade occurs between high income areas such as Japan, the United States, Western Europe, as well as China. They do note that trade is increasing, however, between these high income countries and the developing countries in Asia, South America, and Africa. They also give us a sense of the different types of commodities that are being traded. Okay, so for instance, they note that about 60 countries in the world are dependent on agricultural commodities for more than 40% of their export income, which means that there are 60 countries in the world for whom, when you look at the total export income, at least 40% of that income is coming from the from the export of agricultural commodities. And they also go on to note that in some African countries, this figure is as high as 80%, which means that the majority of the commodities that they export are agricultural commodities. So in doing this, they are trying to show that the profile of commodities being traded by various countries in the world is also different, right? So, for instance, in some African countries, most of what they're exporting is agricultural products. It would be interesting to see which are the countries that are exporting, let's say, finished industrial goods, or maybe even knowledge based products, right? So that would be a very interesting figure for us to consider. I think, now we have spent enough time in this class for us to have that kind of a historical outlook. It would be so interesting if we could have a similar image like this for, let's say, 200 years back, or 500 years back, or 1000 years back. What would the map of the world, a similar map of the world, look like? And I think, of course, we would find a very different picture. The shading for the countries are different. The arrows would also be quite different. Okay, so let's bear that in mind, that of course, when we talk about economic flows, a lot of the conversation, because today we are living in a world where there are definitely heightened economic flows. Okay, so often people think of only contemporary times, but we, right from our first class when we looked at the movement of pepper, right, we know that global trade has existed for a very, very long stretch in human history. A lot of products have moved from one part to very far away parts of the world. Okay. All right. So at this point now, let's take a look at two important concepts. We are going to see the distinction between a trade surplus and a trade deficit. A trade surplus is, so a country with a trade surplus would be one where the value or volume of their exports is much higher than what they are importing into the country from outside. Okay, so Ritzer and Dean give us the example of China as one such country. In contrast to that, a country with a trade deficit would be one where the amount of exports that they are sending outside of their country is much lower than the amount of imports that they're getting into the country. Okay, so it's a majority importer, you can think of it that way. And Ritzer and Dean point out to the United States as one such country.